The Kraken Audio Network weighs in on the offseason moves of the Seattle Kraken.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're bringing you your favorite team every single day. We're in the off season officially for our channel right now, but mostly every day. My name is Ayala. I'm your host, also a contributor over at CBS Sports for hockey and women's basketball. And I am the founder of Black Rosie Media, where we empower Black women and melanated creators in sports media. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Make every moment more. And we know the playoffs are, marching along in the dog days of summer here for MLB, but sports are definitely not stopping. Football getting ready to start up in about a month. We'll be at NHL training camp. So FanDuel still hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. Where we're going to start our show is had a great listen to the most recent episode over on the Kraken Audio Network, and Mike Benton and Everett Fitzhugh, who's been a friend of the pod for sure, both of them friends of the pod. But the overtime summer catch up on the Seattle Kraken Audio Network, they were talking all kinds of things. They had an Jordan Eberle interview, a Shane Wright interview. And I thought that Everett Fitzhugh in particular made some really interesting points. And so a lot of these topics we have talked about before on the podcast, but it's the off season. We're all talking about some of the same things, like Brandon Montour and Chandler Stevenson. Were those good deals? And Everett Fitzhugh did weigh in on those. He also had a really, I thought, illuminating conversation about what kind of a, wedding guest he is. And I freaking loved it. I'm the same way. We're the get the party started kind of wedding, guests. Everyone is going to have a good time if I'm at the reception. I'm just saying. We also got to learn about Everett's karaoke picks, shutting it down with Outcast. I like it, Everett. I like it. I would take you one probably higher. I would say, depending on the vibe, I'm probably going Journey, maybe some Gwen Stefani / No Doubt. Or if you want to, be in your emo vibey kind of mood, maybe some Sheryl Crow. But we can get into my karaoke picks another time. Let's get into some of the things that I took away from Mike's conversation with Everett. Both of them effectively think the Kraken got better since July 1st. And this is what Everett said. You knew you needed to add more offense, and the Kraken did just that. Talking specifically about Montour and Stevenson. And he also mentioned an article that the amazing Allison Lucan wrote about Chandler Stevenson in particular. And this is what Allison wrote. This article was from July 19th. So it's exactly a month from today. It doesn't always show up on a box score, but Stevenson excels at putting the puck where it needs to be via his passing. Looking at just last season, among the forwards on his former team, the Vegas Golden Knights, he was one of the top 3 forwards in terms of executing passes 5-on-5 in each of the 3 zones per Sports Logic. He was also top 3 in terms of completion rate that led to a successful play after, and in the neutral zone, no Vegas skater was better than Stevenson. His 83.4% completion rate wasn't just first overall on his former team. It put him in the top 15 among 497 NHL forwards who played at least 100 minutes, and his overall completion rate of 73.1% ranked in the top 30. Now, here's why I like this, because in the past, if I'm not mistaken, we've talked about Justin Schultz and also Oliver Bjorkstrand in these kind of analytic metrics. And I think that when you have more support, especially I would argue from a centerman whose job effectively it is to do just this, you're getting support from your defensemen, or you have not just the defensemen that are gonna be able to carry that puck out, and it's not always feasible or plausible or ideal for them to do that. So knowing that Chandler Stevenson can connect, I really liked. It's definitely something that Everett liked and gave a shout out, stick taps if you will, to Allison Lucan about that. Now, Everett also estimated that the Seattle Kraken needed a top 6 forward that could compete in the top 6 on one of the top 20 to 25. So basically the top half of the NHL. And he does feel that Chandler Stevenson fits the bill there. Mike also agreed that the Seattle Kraken did indeed get better at the trade, or excuse me, at free agency. Since July 1st, we have gotten better. Now, the question that then both explore is, well, is there something else coming? Is there more coming? And I think the question, as Mike asked it, was really setting Everett up to talk about maybe trades or just outright signings. But Everett took it in a different direction. And I thought that was pretty cool too. And so we're going to talk about that coming up in the second half, or in the second segment. And I'm going to break down some of the nuggets that I think we got from the Shane Wright interview, but more so the Jordan Eberle interview on the Seattle Kraken audio network with Mike Benton and Everett Fitzhugh. That is coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends FanDuel. Now listen, we know it's been a while, as Everett talked about on the episode. It's been about 6 months since there's been significant hockey played for the Seattle Kraken. Of course, we know the Mavericks and the Firebirds were handling business in the postseason. So that's a long time. But no fear, sports fans, FanDuel still has you covered. And I mentioned it earlier, but at this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And if you head over to FanDuel.com right now, some of the things that I think you should take a look at, if you're an NHL fan, if you're a Seattle Kraken fan, are the team points betting odds, and of course, the odds to make the playoffs. Now, the odds to make the playoffs is either yes or no category for your bet. And right now, the Seattle Kraken are at a plus 152 for yes, a minus 196 for no. FanDuel right now is saying that it's a plus 110 for the Seattle Kraken to reach 90 or more points this season. And that's just a few categories. I've talked about future bets. We talked about them since Maddie's Rookie of the Year season. Speaking of Maddie Beniers, we're definitely going to talk about him coming up in the second segment. But I want to make sure that you are getting in on all of these deals that we have from our friends at FanDuel. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball, and of course, us here at the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. You know what I have to say next. You have to listen to Locked On NHL. I've been listening to some of the individual shows, such as Locked On Predators, one of their prospects kind of forcing the issue of the Predators to make a trade. You can get information like that on a team-specific basis. But the thing I love about Locked On NHL is if you don't want to listen to all the other shows, so the rest of the 31 shows, then your best bet is to head over to Locked On NHL to get the high level information that you need, breaking down some of the FanDuel future bets. It's amazing. So make sure you're heading over there. We know you're an everydayer here at Locked On Kraken, but make Locked On NHL your second listen of the day. For the second stanza here, there were two interviews in this most recent podcast or, I don't know what you want to call it. They're calling it overtime, the summer catch up with Mike Benton and Everett Fitzhugh. So, they had a conversation with Shane Wright, but firstly, with Jordan Eberle, asking them a little bit about the offseason, Shane talking about golfing. I really liked Jordan Eberle's insights on being a parent and about, I talked to Brianna Stewart, former Seattle Storm player, of course, now with the New York Liberty. And you hear parents, especially who have young children or just recently first-time parents, and talking about how you get a lot of perspective once you have a child. I do not have any children of my own. I have helped support and raise children, but when you come home, you have to put things into perspective. At least a lot of parents will say that, especially parents who are athletes. And, they don't necessarily care whether you won or lost, or at least not for a long time. And you have to be present there. And I think it's a really cool perspective to have in sports where so much of your contract is directly tied to results. So I appreciated that part of the conversation. Jordan Eberle also talked a decent amount about Matty Beniers. Of course, we're all talking about Matty Beniers here, and he gave a reminder that, hey, Matty B is still young. He's still developing. He's still growing, and he's looking forward to how Matty is just going to continue to attack the work. Jordan Eberle and a lot of other people, myself included, have talked about Matty's work ethic and how that is going to put him over the top, is what a lot of people are expecting. Shane Wright even chimed in a little bit about Matty Beniers later in the episode with Mike and Everett. And so we love to hear that. What we also would love to hear is the Seattle Kraken give us an update on Matty's contract. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the second segment. But let's stick with Jordan Eberle. He also was asked about leadership. We know that the Seattle Kraken have not had a captain since Mark Giordano in the inaugural season. If you listen to Locked On Kraken, if you're an OGer and everydayer and a part of our Locked On Kraken insiders, then I think Jordan Eberle makes a lot of sense as one of our new captains now, or our new captain. Now, the reason that this maybe isn't going to gain a lot of traction is, how much time do we have with Eberle? He did re-sign. That was a deal that we got done. And so he will become an unrestricted free agent in 26-27. In my estimation, that's still plenty of time to have him as a leader. And, I do think Eberle, his role might very well change, even as soon as this season. I don't think that might be too early, but we'll see. But his role is likely going to change if the Seattle Kraken are making the improvements that I think they're making, but I still think he's a great captain. So let's talk about some other players though, including Shane Wright, who again was on this podcast episode. Shane talking, and of course he was asked about Jessica Campbell and Disco Dan Bilesma, who today marks 83 days of his first 100 days. 100 days should be, or the 100th day should be September 5th, which should be around the time that if we don't already have the details, that we should have the details. I'm hoping we'll have the details for training camp because it should start up in a week or so from September 5th. But Shane Wright has been saying in interviews, he's kind of been on a little bit of a media circuit, he wants to make the Seattle Kraken roster. Everett Fitzhugh and Mike Benton talked about Shane Wright specifically, and we're going to, in the next segment, talk about who's in, who's out. But Shane Wright is huge as a part of that cog, a piece. I think it's pretty, I've been kind of saying it this way, the writing's on the wall, I think, when it comes to some members of the Seattle Kraken, including, or that were on the team last year, including Edouard Bellemare, And we've even seen Shane Wright slot in before Bellemare in the back end of the season. I think that Shane Wright is doing all of the things that he needs to do in the public eye to show and prove that he's ready, that he's matured. And you also hear from Everett Fitzhugh, and I agree with him, that he had a tenacity. He had a hunger. He almost had, he was playing with a chip on his shoulder when he was able to play in the playoffs for the Coachella Valley Firebirds. I think the first few games back after taking that hit in the Ontario Reign game were a little tough on him, and we talked about that on the podcast. But then he became an undeniable piece of what was going right for the Firebirds. Now, I think they did run out of gas. They lost focus. That's what happens when you have a younger team. And so it's going to be very interesting to see. Everett at one time in the podcast talked about giving the keys to the young people. We've been talking about that for weeks, for months now. Even with Jason Hernandez, the voice of the Firebirds at Acrisure Arena. We've been talking about that. And I think it seems the most plausible thing that there's going to be a little bit of give and take with signing new names and giving a chance for some Firebirds to make the squad. And so that's where I said that Mike kind of left Everett in a situation to answer a question about making moves, and Everett took it in a different direction. And I think really has us focused on what's coming through the pipeline. And so that is what we're going to talk about coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Mentioned it before, gonna mention it again. You got to check out, of course, Locked On NHL. You can make that your second listen of the day and enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the National Hockey League. Of course, Locked On NHL is available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, just like everything else on the Locked On Podcast Network, including, of course, Locked On Kraken. So Locked On Kraken, Locked On NHL, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your team every day. And we have some members of the Locked On Podcast Network that are heading to the nation's capital, the other Washington, D.C., as part of a podcast convention. I met some people from Tegna at a conference that I was at in LA, and I knew about this upcoming conference. Locked On is actually one of the sponsors of this. So, it's kind of cool to see the Locked On Podcast Network continue to grow. The partnership with Tegna, I'm super excited about. I actually got to connect very briefly with one of the correspondents from King 5 that was in Paris. And that was kind of cool because Chris Egan was in Paris, and I was at a women's basketball game in the I think it was on the days of when they were awarding medals. So, the last day of the Olympics, and I see someone wearing a King 5, like a pullover or something. And I just said hello, and I was like, "Hey, I'm the host of Locked On Kraken." And they're like, "Hey, you're part of the Tegna family," and all of this stuff. So it's really cool to see Locked On and Tegna now they're so excited. When I tell you I was at this conference, they're so excited to have the Seattle Kraken on their airwaves and to bring Kraken coverage to the regional area. So I'm excited what that means for us potentially. So we're still trying to figure out what that could mean, but we will definitely let you know. Okay, let's go back to this Seattle Kraken team and potentially what we will see and its impact on the Coachella Valley Firebirds. Now, if you listen to the last few episodes, we did a Firebirds Friday. So we focused on the new head coach, what this could potentially mean, also some of the departures for the Firebirds. This is sometimes what happens when you have not just a change in leadership, Dan Bilesma, of course, coming to the Seattle Kraken, but also you have to make some tough decisions at times when you want to pursue another opportunity to win a championship. And as we've even seen with the Florida Panthers, sometimes you have to let some people go, or they want to kind of move on and try something new. So it's been interesting to see how that's impacted the Firebirds. So we talked about that on Friday. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but there are some names that, as Everett Fitzhugh said, he didn't give specific names. So I'm going to give some names, but there are some names, whether Everett explicitly said it or not, that we should be looking out for to see what they do in training camp. And maybe we don't make a big splash like Everett was saying in free agency. He's not expecting that, especially because we need that Matty Beniers contract signed, right? And he's not expecting that there will be another signing. He did say two things that I thought were so interesting. One is that he's expecting competition to be fierce in training camp, and maybe some folks that we have in the Firebird system will make their way to the opening roster. The second thing that he said is he wouldn't be surprised to see an early season trade. So maybe we don't see the trade in the quote unquote off season, but maybe there's something that happens early in the regular season where we do offload some contract. Either way, I've been saying it. I think the writing's on the wall with players like Brandon Tanev, likely Yanni Gourde to an extent. But here are some players that could push the issue to make the roster, the opening day roster for the Seattle Kraken. And you have to think about players like Shane Wright, of course. Everyone's expecting Shane Wright to be on the NHL roster. So I kind of already said that effectively takes Pierre-Edouard Bellemare out of contention. We know that Kyler Yamamoto no longer with the team. So perhaps that's where, you look at Stevenson coming in on the forward line in particular. But what about Ty Cartier? We haven't heard a lot about him. What also about Logan Morrison, John Hayden, and Ryan Winterton? Ryan Winterton, there's actually an article up by Darren Brown on Ryan Winterton and just, him taking time away to heal from an injury and what he learned throughout the journey, the push to the playoffs with the Coachella Valley Firebirds. So go check that out over on NHL.com/Kraken. You can find that article. But those are some interesting names. John Hayden signing a one-way, 1-year contract, 775 AAV. According to Desert Sun, they do a great job covering the Firebirds. The fact that it's a one-way contract indicates that the Kraken might be expecting to have Hayden on the roster in Seattle. So between those guys, Winterton, Logan Morrison, John Hayden, Shane Wright, who do you think has the best chance from the forward crew to make the opening roster? Then you have to think about defensemen. So we're thinking Vince Dunn, Adam Larson, Brandon Montour, Jamie Alexiak. These are the names actually as Everett said them. Then you've got Borgen and Evans. So that's another name that we're pretty much assuming Riker Evans is going to be on the roster. So that leaves Josh Mahura as that seventh defenseman. And the reason that Everett was breaking this down is because he was being asked about PTOs, again, asked about maybe making another signing, which I personally would be okay with. But again, where the Kraken are with respect to cap space, and we talked about this a few times last week, so check out those episodes if you haven't. Knowing that they still have to sign Matty Beniers, it's unlikely that without a trade, the Kraken are going to sign anyone else. The next signing should be Matty Beniers. And I agree with Everett on that. But I also think it's very interesting to once again, at least in theory, have a situation where the Seattle Kraken training camp should be very, very competitive. And that leads me to go back to, as we start to close out today's show, to go back to what are we going to get from Disco Dan? And I think that he is going to be he will epitomize the 3 Fs: fun, fast, and forechecking. Here is what we heard from Everett on the podcast. He recounted a story that Dan Bylsma said after he was let go from Buffalo. He said, Everett is recounting this story, and he said, "My son looks at me," he says, "Well, Dad, at least now you can have fun coaching." And in that moment, Dan Bilesma is recounting, and Everett retold this story. In that moment and over time, that stuck with him, and it's changed his philosophy. We've talked about how Dan saw the opportunity even just to be with the Charlotte Checkers. Call back to be with the Charlotte Checkers and to take that assistant coaching role in the hopes that he would become the AHL head coach, which of course he did. But when we were co-parenting with the Florida Panthers in Charlotte, Dan knew that his approach to coaching was going to be different, and in no small part to what his son said. Now you can have fun coaching again. And that's what we talked about at the end of the Firebird season last season, as we knew he was coming into this role. Dan likes to have fun. He can also hold guys accountable, and that is important. I think that at times, even with us in the media, Dave was a little tough. He was a tough shell to crack. I've said a few times. And listen, as someone who is like that, I completely understand it. And we're at a time where there has to be a little bit more fluidity. There has to be more nimbleness to the Seattle Kraken. That is what's required. Changing on the fly, if you will. And I think Dan's disposition is really primed for that. Not that I don't think Dave could have done it and did it in some ways, but sometimes you need to accelerate the process. And that's what I'm getting from the Disco Dan era, including what we'll see from the development pipeline. And we talked a lot about that with respect to what that will look like for Coachella Valley on Friday's episode. So if you haven't listened to that, go check that out. A few things just to wrap up here. I want to let you know that I have my dates that I will be in Seattle for training camp, for preseason, and yes, for the first season, for the first game at Climate Pledge Arena. But that also means I'll be in town for the Seattle Kraken 5K. Are you planning to run in this? I see that Sound of Hockey has a team. I see that Ladies of the Kraken have a team. The Seattle Kraken 5K is going to be on Saturday, October 5th. There are a few ways that you can participate. You can do a virtual 5K and you do it kind of on your own pace. You can set your own route, or you can do the physical 5K. And also there's a free kids dash from 9 to 9:30. And there's all these different heats that you can opt into. I am definitely going to be more closer to the walkers. I might not walk the whole thing, but I'm definitely going to be walking at some point in time. And this is presented by Virginia Mason Franciscan Health. It will take place, as I mentioned, on October 5th at Green Lake Park. Proceeds from the event benefit Kraken Hockey Fights Cancer Fund. It will kickstart the 24-25 season. Everett Fitzhugh, who I mentioned was just on with Mike Benton, will host the festivities, which will feature members of the broadcast team, Bowie, and other Kraken special guests. So go ahead and register. And if you need the link, check out our link in the show notes in our description, because I will be there. I know I've been reaching out, or I have heard from a few fans, longtime everyday OG listeners. Thank you so much for tuning in. I don't have the training camp dates yet. If you listen to the interview with Mike and Everett, you can deduce and assume that we're pretty close to a month out. So I'm thinking around the 14th, 15th. I have some Seattle Storm stuff that I'm planning to do around that time. So I'll be in town either way, but hopefully I'll be there for the start of training camp this year. Either way, I will definitely be there for preseason and for that first home game in the middle of the afternoon, at least on Pacific time. So I'm excited. I'm going to do the 5K. I'm going to meet some of y'all. I'm going to do some Storm coverage. All of the things are happening. And a way that you can continue to support even more of that is by subscribing to Locked On Kraken, leaving us a review. Let us know what you like, what's working. Also become a member of the Locked On Kraken Insiders. We have a new little segment that I'm going to be playing around with. We're going to use it with the insiders first, but stock up or stock down. And so I'll be incorporating that into the show every once in a while, but we're going to do a little test drive, if you will, with the Locked On Kraken Insiders. If you want to become a part of the Locked On Kraken Insiders, you can do so by texting 918 731-3154, 918-731-3154. You get a 7-day free trial. And then after that, you will be billed monthly less than $5 a month. Well, that's it for our show. I appreciate you always making Locked On Kraken your first listen of the day. Now it's time for you to head over to Locked On NHL. And remember, we have the women's hockey spotlight every other Friday, and that will be this Friday. And I'm going to go over something that we've talked about here, but as it relates to the women's hockey tournament at the Olympics. What do we know? What don't we know? And what teams should we be looking out for as they get ready for preparations for Milano Cortina 2026? Be kind to yourselves, be kind to one another, and always we hold fast, we stay true, and we say loud and proud, let's go Kraken. Hey, come join me for the Seattle Kraken 5K. Either way, I will catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody. Enjoy your day. Oh, and go check out these videos if you're still on YouTube.